Here's an idea. Violence is the removal of choice. Previously on Idea Channel, we've talked about violence and how I think of violence as a removal of choice. Violence is the interruption of inertia, the removal of possibility, and most importantly, of choice. We've defined violence as the potentially aggressive removal of an actor's choice in a situation. The idea that violence is characterized mainly by the inability to choose has raised questions and inspired some confusion, so I thought we might spend some time on it. Violence is often spoken about as one particular thing: bodily harm, maybe aggressive bodily harm. The legal concept of violence cites the use of physical force. Think movement, activity, bodies. What I'm gonna argue is that violence is about choice as much or more so than it is about bodies, that it can in fact be passive, and that there's an important ethical dimension to thinking of violence as more than just physical violence, which is only one of many different kinds of violence. Physical violence is the type of violence that we hear about the most often. It's the violence in violent movies, violent video games, violent sports where characters, avatars, and players are gruesomely murdered or endure physical harm. In violent crimes, victims are injured or killed. But this gets complicated pretty quickly. Let's do a gut check and be honest. If someone is mugged and they're stabbed, do you call that a violent crime? Probably. What if they're threatened and pushed over as their assailant takes their bag? They fall and they bruise their knee, but otherwise they're physically unharmed. Is that a violent crime? What about if they're threatened, hand over their bag, and the mugger just runs away? No physical contact at all. Is that a violent crime? I think crimes most people would call violent tend to involve excessive force. Force is sometimes the means, sometimes the end of the crime, but when it comes to the phrase violent crime, I have a sense that force is imagined to be extreme in some way. A bruised knee isn't the result of a violent crime, but a stab wound is. However, typically, law enforcement would consider all of the muggings that I described as violent. The FBI's Uniform Crime Reports, for instance, classifies offenses which involve force or the threat of force as violent crimes. Implicitly, we can interpret this as support for the idea that it's not just physical harm which makes a crime violent, but the position a victim is put in when faced with physical harm or its possibility, one where they have little or no agency, little or no ability to act, to make meaningful choices. Beyond physical harm, violence would seem to be the whole or partial negation of agency through force. Personally, I first encountered a version of this idea in the writings of theater director Anne Bogart. In her book A Director Prepares, she writes that an initiating creative act, the first brushstroke on a canvas, the first set piece on a stage, is a violent act. It can't be undone. Erased or removed maybe, but the initial action lives in our history. Decisive actions are violent when they're forceful and can't be meaningfully retracted. Bogart says creative decisiveness, a force which she equates with cruelty, quote, extinguishes the spontaneity of the moment. It creates a point after which anything is no longer possible. Actors, Bogart says, are heroic because they invite and work within this artistic violence, a space of ever diminishing creative options as they head for their performative ideal of repetition. Bogart was writing about the hard work of a director, not making an incisive theoretical point. But her ideas about artistic violence have wide-ranging applications when talking about other kinds of violence. They're echoed in tons of literature on the subject and provide, I think, a good organizing concept for the work of others. Laura Tanner, for instance, writing 7 years earlier, presages Bogart's sentiments, but in application to physical violence on bodies which do not invite it. In her book Intimate Violence, she writes, while Freud associated scopophilia, which is the pleasure of looking, with the idea of taking other people as objects, the same process of objectification underlies violence, in which violators dehumanize their intended victims and look at them not as people, but as inanimate objects. Tanner writes about how physical violence co-opts the fundamental subjectivity of a human body and its consciousness and uses it to transform that body into a thing, something that can't act, an object. It uses the experience of having a body to deny that body's own agency. To put it in Bogart's words, physical violence and threats of it extinguish the spontaneity of not just a moment, but a person. To put it another way, over and above the bodily harm that may characterize physical violence, there's a violence as such that physical violence requires. And through law enforcement and the work of Bogart and Tanner, we've uncovered how that violence as such is a force which transforms a person into a thing, a force which removes agency. And that being the case, we can start to look elsewhere for forces which extinguish spontaneity beyond the physical and ask how they too may be seen for what they truly are: violent. Helpfully, Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek draws a distinction. On the one hand, he writes of subjective violence, which is what we've been talking about, violence with a clear perpetrator, like a criminal. On the other hand, he talks of the somewhat confusingly named objective violence, which he describes as invisible because it's widespread, has no clear singular source, and is very easy to confuse with just how things are, the natural seeming operations of languages, societies, governments, etc. Nonetheless, objective violence possesses that characteristic agency negation. Žižek further splits objective violence into symbolic violence and systemic violence. Symbolic violence has a lot of forms. One example is hate speech, because it determines the very being and social existence of its subject. Hate speech may not force the oppressed to literally become how they are interpreted by bigots, but it unavoidably affects their socially constructed image, a force which then determines how they can or feel they must act in the world. Symbolic violence also exists within language as a whole, in that it coerces experiences and descriptions of the world into its own restrictive symbology. In the way hate speech pigeonholes people, language itself pigeonholes reality. Systemic violence, by comparison, is a little more concrete. Žižek writes that it's the violence inherent in a system, not only direct physical violence, but also the more subtle forms of coercion that sustain relations of domination and exploitation, including the threat of violence. Systemic violence is what allows the gap between the rich and the poor to grow. It accounts for how oppressed peoples become and then stay oppressed. Sometimes, as is the case in North Korea, systemic violence and physical violence are intimately linked, while in other places, like many parts of the West, systemic violence is often considered nothing more than the rational operation of cultures, economies, or governments. It is simply the way things are, or if you like, pure ideology. The point being, both symbolic and systemic violence apply some measure of force, physical, cognitive, social, cultural, ontological, such that the agency of their victim is either partially or entirely negated. It may not be a moment of violence, as in a mugging, but it is a state of violence, a fact of it. Now, a sticking point here may involve use of the word force. In systems especially, be they linguistic, economic, or digital, how is there force if the perpetrator is the way things are, static code, or literal infrastructure/bureaucracy? Whatever I've claimed is being violent takes literally no action, so how is there force? To help address this, we can take some inspiration from Newton. When one body exerts force on a second body, the second body exerts an equal and opposite force. Of course, Newton was talking about physical forces, and forces of objective violence may not jump out of a bush and somehow actively restrict your communication or physically prevent you from joining the middle class, but there are endless situations, both symbolic and systemic, where when attempting to act, one is prevented, partially or wholly. The use of the third law here is metaphoric. We may push on systemic structures, and though the structure is gargantuan, inanimate, and rigid, it certainly pushes back. That is its force. That is how systems extinguish spontaneity through violence. To circle back then to where we started, such forces aren't normally thought violent because violence, commonly considered, is active. It's thought of as gross, excessive, vicious, aggressive, and manic. We think of violence as action and bodies, but it's also a force exerted through passivity. When we consider violence as the whole or partial negation of agency through force and then understand the full implication of force, we can see how these other forms of violence are also gross, excessive, vicious, and aggressive, just not necessarily physically. To me, this gets at the ethics of such a concept of violence. It allows us to appreciate more completely what about and in the world is violent. It allows us to see how the use and threat of force goes far, far beyond implements that cause bodily harm. It gives us a strategy for considering and appreciating more completely the methods of violence in the world, many of which may seem deeply and deceptively inactive. But as we've seen, and as Zizek says in the last line of his book on the subject, sometimes doing nothing is the most violent thing to do. What do y'all think? I'm especially curious to hear how you would apply this concept of violence to other things that we strongly associate with violence. Things like sports, illness, animals and nature, and BDSM. We'll talk about those things in next week's comment response video, but before then, I would love to hear how you would apply this concept of violence to those areas. Let us know in the comments. In this week's comment response video, we talk about your thoughts regarding 3D printing and copyright. If you want to watch that one, you can click here or find a link in the doobly-doo. Are you or someone you know a liberal arts unicorn? If so, you can buy yourself or them the new Idea Channel t-shirt featuring that very thing in an awesome illustration by friend of the show, Andrea/Art Sparrow. It includes my personal favorite, the slogan Omnia Sunt Gravia, which translates from the Latin roughly to all things are interesting. If you want to grab this t-shirt, you can go to dftba.com, find a link in the doobly-doo, and we'll probably also put a merch card right here. A small bit of news from the production side of things. We're gonna try something new. We're gonna try a less strict upload schedule going forward. What that means is if it gets to around midday Eastern on Wednesday and we feel like we could spend another couple hours or another day on an episode, we're gonna do that in hopes that we will be able to make it that much better. So if we haven't uploaded something on Wednesday afternoon, you can look for it on Thursday or on Friday. The idea is that we're definitely still gonna try to release things once a week, but not be so strict as to release it at the same time every Wednesday, so we can give everything a little bit extra polish. If we haven't uploaded and you're worried, you can always check in on Twitter, on Facebook, or on the subreddit, on my personal Twitter account. I'll try to update those things as we're moving through production if it looks like we're gonna be uploading at some time other than midday Eastern on Wednesday. We have a Facebook, an IRC, and a subreddit where I have been posting in-progress scripts for upcoming Idea Channel episodes. If you want to read those and give us comments on them, I would love to hear them. Links to all those places in the doobly-doo. The tweet of the week comes from Erica the Dev, who points us towards a really interesting interview with someone who used to be, I forget right now, he was like the head of product or development or something at Adobe, talking about when Adobe had to confront the fact that their software was being pirated, and him trying to convince the top brass that that was their freemium option, which is just such a forward-looking and accepting way of looking at that. It's a great listen, it's a great read. Yeah, check it out. And of course, this week's episode would not have been possible or good without the very hard work of these heroic actors.